Chapter 32 Tea Leaves and Dinner Deals. Hariel. Hariel had been here before, in the same place for a similar ceremony, with several of the same people, though the weather had been warmer back then. 2 weeks after his death, they were at Driftmark for Sir Leonor's funeral, held in the tradition of his house, and Hariel was experiencing déjà vu. We join today at the seat of the sea to commit to Lord Leonor of House Velaryon to the eternal waters, the dominion of the Merlin King, where he will guard him for all the days to come. Vaemond Velaryon spoke the funeral eulogy somberly, standing by Leonor's casket as he done with Lena. The stone and wood casket was carved in the likeness of a man instead of a woman, and was being prepared for its final voyage. Though the king had been too ill for the journey, the funeral didn't lack for royal representatives. Queen Alicent and her youngest son had arrived by ship, while their 3 eldest arrived on their dragons. Rhaenyra was present too, of course, with the kids and all the Velaryons. And once again, the funeral was being overshadowed by the drama of the living. The Queen and Sir Criston kept casting hateful glares toward Princess Rhaenyra, who was reacting defensively. Aegon looked like he was bored with the entire ordeal. Daemon was basking in the appropriate attention while Princess Rhaenys comforted Rhaena and Baela while completely ignoring her grandsons who had just lost their father. Corlys behaved disconnected and out of it though, which was different. The wake wasn't an improvement either, where the guests switched between reminiscing about Sir Laenor the Unburnt one moment and gossiping about his wife the next. I can't believe she's already remarried, Hariel heard while passing a group of gossiping ladies. I can't believe she brought her new husband to the previous one's funeral. We're not the only ones shocked. I was there when the royal party arrived and first heard the news. The queen was scandalized. At that remark they giggled under their breath. As we all were. Think of the children. Hale just kept walking. Their gossip was nothing she hadn't heard at every corner, several speaking words Hale agreed with. What the fuck had they been thinking? It made her so mad Hariel could barely look at them. Helena was seated on the bench to the side, gazing into a drink instead of socializing. The princess was focusing in a way Hariel knew meant she was busy and didn't want to be disturbed. Hariel looked around for someone else, but abruptly turned back to study Helena's behavior once again. Are you reading tea leaves? Hariel blurted, and since she'd interrupted at the wrong time, Helena was annoyed when she looked up. I'm making an attempt to, Helena said, eyes fixed briefly on Hariel's elbow before returning to her cup. Though divination wasn't her thing, Hariel's curiosity was engaged now, and she decided to sit down and rest her feet. She made herself comfortable on the opposite end of the bench, careful to leave space for another person to fit between them to prevent triggering Helena's touch aversion, and watched the crowd silently while waiting to be acknowledged. Aegon accepted a goblet of wine from a boy serving drinks, not bothering with his usual smiles, which was the moment Hariel noted all the servants were men during this funeral. He took a gulp of his wine and eyed Lady Hazelhart's behind when she passed, leaving Hariel with the urge to pour the bottle of wine over Aegon's head. He was to marry in 2 weeks. His betrothed was mere steps away, with a front row view while Aegon was blatantly checking out the pretty blonde woman from House Hart. Of course Hariel knew neither were in love with each other, and actually thought better of Aegon for not being interested in bedding Baela yet, but was it too much to ask the guy showed the bare minimum of public composure? It would save them both pain. Did Aegon have any idea the shitstorm he was about to face in Baela? Hariel didn't think so, and she feared how he'd react to it. While his brother made eyes at noblewomen, Aemond was preoccupied, with barely a second to spare as he made the rounds. She'd seen him talk with Hagrid for a while, his queen mother, the Hand, Princess Rhaenys, Corlys, some Velaryons, and even made himself talk to Jacaerys. He was still going, but the one exception was how he avoided Baela, though she was keeping clear of him too. It made Hariel wonder what had caused their fight that day. It had been swept aside because of Sir Laenor, and she still didn't know more than, "The kid insulted me, so I punched him." It took nearly half an hour before Helena broke the silence. It's an obscure art, reading the portent of dreams and leaves. Helena turned the cup in her hand. Though I found they can coincide with one repeating what I've seen in the other. Is this a pattern I should heed, or do I see the patterns because I look for them? I can't answer that. what do you believe? That I want the ringing to stop, Helena said. What ringing bothers you, princess? For once in my head, Helena said tiredly. What do you mean? They rang for Princess Emma and Sir Leno's deaths. They rang for my sister's wedding to our uncle. They'll ring for Aegon and Bela's wedding, and they've rung in the north too. Ariel wasn't following anymore. The north? Helena put the cup in her lap and made a half-hearted attempt to meet her eyes. We are made aware when there's a wedding in a noble house. I thought you'd want to know, even if it may pain you. But just before we left for Driftmark, a raven came from Winterfell, bearing tidings of the union between Lord Cregan Stark and Lady Ara Norre. Ariel took in the message with mixed emotions. I see. There was some jealousy picturing Cregan kissing some unknown girl, but at the same time it felt plain weird too. Somewhere in the north, Cregan was walking around Winterfell a married man, when just months ago he'd kissed her. But curiously, Ariel found it didn't hurt as she'd expected. She'd known for months Cregan would marry Lady Ara and that the girl was at Winterfell, so this next step wasn't a big leap for Ariel to picture. Her days with Cregan remained a sweet and brief memory in her mind, but in the past. Then, I wished them a long, happy life together. You do? Ariel nodded. Because Cregan had married the girl he chose, and after seeing so many of her friends miserable or worried about their future marriages, there was something very uplifting in that. At the same time, Ariel had expected the news of his marriage. Didn't Cregan say Lady Ara was too young? But maybe his family pressured him for the sake of stability. She could easily see that happen, especially with his uncle's line so secure and Lady Ara living as a ward at Winterfell. There was a part of her disappointed as well, because the girl was 14, at most 15 by this date, and Cregan knew she was too young. He'd said so himself. Did you see any other bells in that cup? Ariel asked, gesturing to her tea. Can I look too? Helena easily allowed the change of subject and handed the cup over. Please do. I wonder what you see. Do you believe that looks like a trident? Ariel pulled the cup to and from her face at different lengths to adjust her vision, since she hadn't brought her reading glasses to the funeral. I think it looks like my Nimbus 2000. What is that? My racing broomstick, Ariel said, and felt supremely stupid for saying it. Just a broom. Not far away, the twins were watching them speculatively, and Ariel put a stop to it simply by gesturing for them to come join them. Is there something in the cup? Bela asked directly, chin high and judgmental. It wouldn't be unusual for Helena to trap insects in her cup, but Bela was wrong this time. Tea leaves, Helena said. Perchance they'll see something? Ariel held it out for them to try. Helena says there's a trident in the tea leaves, but I think it's a broom. What do you think? The twins exchanged an unreadable look before Rhaena accepted the cup and glanced into it briefly. There's only wet leaves in here. But what patterns do they form? Helena inquired. Imagine the tea leaves are like the clouds in the sky you're viewing from the ground. What do the shapes they make resemble to you? I see neither. Bela sighed. I don't know. Maybe a bone? Turn it sideways. Is it still the same then? Helena suggested, trying to be helpful. That is different, Bela said sarcastic. Now it's a broken bone. The biting tone was impossible to miss, and Helena held out her hand to have her cup back with a blank expression. What was the purpose of this? Rhaena asked, giving the princess her cup and trying to smooth over the awkwardness. Ariel was thankful she tried. We were attempting to see which is the better dragon dreamer. Alicent. The day before her son's wedding, Alicent stood on the balcony as the party from Dragonstone appeared on the horizon. They'd been expected to show around noon, so when the guards on the watchtowers alerted of their approach, half the court spilled out onto the balconies to watch the dragons fly in over Blackwater Bay. For a moment, Alicent was brought back in time, to a day she'd watched House Velaryon arrive for Rhaenyra and Sir Laenor's wedding. Once more, Meleys was flying in for a wedding, but Sea Smoke wasn't. The few would notice the absence among so many dragons. As the bride-to-be, Baela arrived at the head of the procession astride her pale green dragon Moondancer. Behind her, Lucerys' white beast Eric soared side by side with the black-scaled Ebryon. Then the green dragon Vermex with Jace as its rider, followed by the blue Norbert, the red queen Meleys, with the long-necked Caraxes and yellow Syrax making up the tail end. When they reached the borders of the city, their formations broke off, changing directions to spiral in wide circles. With a gentle smile, Alicent lifted her hands and began clapping, and soon everyone followed her cue, just as 3 more dragons joined the horde. As he'd been expected, Alicent's 3 eldest were out flying, and she observed Sunfire, Dreamfire and Vermithor join the Dragonstone party to great applause. Aegon steered Sunfire to fly by his bride's side, but it was also a meeting of 2 beasts who'd barely interacted in the past, and watching the 2 dragons start dancing in the air made Alicent nervous. Sunfire is beautiful in the sun. His scales shimmers golden. Alicent heard Lady Elenda Baratheon admire Aegon's dragon. 3, 4, 5, 6... Oh no, did I already count that one? Another was counting the dragons on his fingers, struggling whenever one of the dragons disappeared around the side of the castle during their circling. It was then Aegon and Baela seemed to regain command of their dragons, and Alicent relaxed when they began flying side by side in wide loops above the city. Ebryon is already strong enough to fly Lady Rhaena? Daeron spoke barely loud enough to be heard, his blue eyes trailing after the black dragon as it passed. Ebryon was half the age of Daeron's dragon Tessarion, but though it was notably the smallest, it must have managed to carry Lady Rhaena from Dragonstone regardless. It's reckless. Alicent placed a comforting hand on Daeron's back, knowing how frustrated he was to be grounded. Tessarion was strong enough to carry Daeron for short stretches, but to introduce him into a horde of dragons like this, with so many new beasts Tessarion had never met whilst he was still inexperienced? Alicent had put her foot down. It's thoughtless to risk Lady Rhaena's safety for something like this. Did you learn nothing from the fate that nearly befell Lady Hariel? Her inexperience with a young, willful dragon left Lady Hariel helpless while Norbert carried her off north when she mounted it too early. Don't fear, dear. You will be flying Tessarion to and from the High Tower in due time. Daeron hummed and glanced over towards the Baratheons just as Lady Aline looked back. Aline smiled brightly, blue eyes crinkling, and Daeron returned it with a polite nod. Alicent pretended not to notice when Lady Aline's sweet smile faltered. Daeron had been allowed to pick his betrothed among Lord Borros's 4 daughters, and chosen Lady Aline. Alicent approved, but after they spent more time together awaiting Aegon's wedding, there had been a few incidents where the lady had been of annoyance to Daeron. She's impatient, he'd concluded a week before. For your marriage? For everything, Daeron said. For walking down the hallway or supper or tea or for a snowflake to fall. She can hardly sit still longer than a brief conversation. She'll grow out of it, dear, Alicent promised, though she too had begun to notice how restless Lady Aline could act. Sweet, pretty and vivacious, of course, but Alicent understood what Daeron meant, but expected she'd mature out of those habits. Daeron was a dutiful and proper prince, a squire studying in Old Town under the guardianship of House Hightower. Alicent knew Daeron would only be contented with a gracious sovereign lady for wife, which Lady Baratheon was aware of too. She wouldn't let her daughter bring shame on House Baratheon, and there were many years before they were to wed. Some Baratheons were known for being boisterous and lively, but Aline was a daughter, not a son, and Alicent assumed it was a childish phase she'd outgrow. No, it wasn't the betrothal between Daeron and Aline which worried her. It wasn't even Aegon's. Time was slipping by fast for Alicent. The weeks leading up to Aegon's wedding felt like they'd been swallowed into an abyss, and she had no idea how they'd reach this point. By this time on the morrow, her firstborn son would be a married man. She looked forward to this since Aegon was but a babe in her arms, believing it'd be both a joy and a difficulty to be replaced by a wife, because who would the bride be? Alicent had strived diligently so Rhaenyra's sins wouldn't contaminate her family. Betrothing Aegon and Helaena was to make sure Viserys couldn't be swayed by his eldest daughter's honeyed lies again. For a while it seemed to work, but Alicent wasn't sure where it all went wrong. Aegon's wife was supposed to be Helaena, and though Alicent firmly condemned incest, her children were true-born blood of the dragon. It wasn't sinful with them, as the faith acknowledged the Valyrian purity running through the blood of her royal children. Their union would have brought House Targaryen strength and prosperity. Even if Aegon had been displeased in the beginning, whilst Helena's unusual quirks became more prominent, young as they were, her children hadn't comprehended the threat they were facing, and that Alicent had done it for their own good. Aegon's queen would be her sweet daughter, and as a sister, Aegon would surely respect and love Helaena. Alicent was confident that he'd find happiness once they settled into their marriage, just as Alicent had found with Viserys. Yet somehow her plans ended up in flames. The council and Viserys broke the betrothal, and now Aegon was to marry Baela Targaryen, whilst Helaena... Alicent couldn't even think it. The stress of everything made preparing for Aegon's marriage a welcome distraction, nearly a source of relaxation, because everything else was driving her to the brink of madness, and as always Rhaenyra was the source of everything going wrong in her life. Alicent had felt compassion when Rhaenyra's daughter died, and she'd prayed for Aemma. It's what came immediately after that disgusted her. Rhaenyra had used her shawl of grief to sway Lady Joanna's compassion, and now there were talks of betrothing one of Rhaenyra's sons to one of Jason Lannister's daughters. But if the way she used her daughter's death to her advantage was shameful, it was nothing compared to Rhaenyra's disgraceful behavior after her husband's demise. Rhaenyra hadn't even waited for a funeral before falling into bed with her uncle. The princess had no shame, no decency, no respect for the crown or House Velaryon, to be more preoccupied making an outrageous match for herself in the middle of a mourning period. Prince Daemon had been disinherited decades ago, but now he was to be king consort. Her husband had been furious to hear it, and yet that's as far as he'd gone. How did Viserys not see the danger his brother posed to their sons? Did he not see the murderous beast lurking in those soulless eyes? The funeral had been a scandal, and utterly overshadowed by how the widow attended it with her new husband, and Alicent had seen for herself the icy reaction of Rhaenys and Corlys. But what could they do? Rhaenyra was clambering to Laenor's trueborn son like a little hostage, and Rhaenys and Corlys wouldn't want to lose more after the death of their son, and in a very suspicious circumstances too. Alicent found it incredibly suspicious, and carried a coiling feeling that Prince Daemon had something to do with that tavern fight. Who else would know how to arrange one than the Lord of Fleabottom? The issue was that Alicent couldn't prove it, and neither could Larys, and now Princess Rhaenys and Lord Corlys were stuck because Daemon and Rhaenyra controlled all their grandchildren, Viserys, Visenya, Baela and Rhaena. Though from tomorrow, Baela would be under Aegon's protection. It was partly how Alicent had found relief in arranging the wedding, because there she had perfect control of the outcome. She could pick the proper chair and table placements for the feast, the menu, the decorations, the entertainment. Since the wedding was at the Red Keep, she had full control over the process. Control she lacked in everything else surrounding it. Alicent's attention was caught when people began pointing towards the sky. Tilting her head back, Alicent spotted the blue dragon ridden by Hariel had turned into a sharp nosedive. As it plummeted down, Norbert inexplicably began spinning. Was the dragon supposed to do that, or had Lady Hariel lost control? Was the dragon injured? Was it the wing? Several gasped and Alicent's heart lodged into her throat, because Norbert was about to collide snout first into Blackwater Bay. At the last moment the dragon abruptly regained control, wings fanning wide when she straightened up, and Alicent thought she saw the ocean ripple where its powerful spiked tail hit the surface. Daeron started clapping, laughing at the display, and soon more joined in on the applause. Alicent realized a beat later that it had been a kind of flying trick. The performance entertained the spectators. Norbert arced up from the water, soaring up where they were met by Vermithor and Aemond. The Norbert was notably big for such a young dragon, it remained small next to the bronze fury Vermithor. Norbert resembles the Serian slightly, doesn't she? Daron remarked. Alison's heart hadn't settled back to its preferred rhythm yet, so it took her a moment to compose her voice. They do have some similarities. Daron's dragon Tessarian had copper scales across her body with cobalt blue wings. Norbert was also a blend of copper and blue, but with different arrangements and shades. Her scales were a lighter shade of blue, closer to Dreamfire's color than Tessarian, while the copper appeared only on her horns and spikes. Curiously, Norbert and Tessarian were the only two dragons to breathe blue fire, though Norbert could change her fire from normal red to a very hot blue, whilst Tessarian's was always a deep cobalt blue fire. After spending the majority of her life in King's Landing, Alison had familiarized herself with the dragons, yet she'd never seen so many soaring above the capital simultaneously. There was a good reason for it too: it wasn't safe. The applauding spectators might assume them a united litter of tamed dragons playfully soaring in the sun and doing tricks, but Alicent was aware a few didn't like each other, such as Dreamfire and Vermithor, which was ironic considering who their writers were. Yes, that might be. Alicent heard her husband laugh good-humouredly in response to something said by Lord Jasper. Viserys was seated by the balcony railing, with blankets and furs to keep him warm whilst the Master of Laws gestured to where Vermithor and Norbert disappeared around the side of the castle. Lady Harrel is also quite daring, and look how large Norbert has grown. To think the dragon only 5 yet comparable in size with my daughter's dragon Cyrex, who's 30. You can't deny Rubeus Hagrid knows what he's doing. With hardly a cloud in the sky, the sun shone high and warm across King's Landing. It was a beautiful winter day, with as perfect conditions as any dragon rider could ask for. So Alicent watched them fly by whilst calculating the situation in her head. They'd arrived with 8 dragons able to carry a rider, but that was without counting Vhagar, or those 2 small such as Tyraxes and Thunderstrike, bonded to Joffrey and Visenya each. Had Rhaenyra been too occupied with her new husband, or had she spared a second to introduce Prince Viserys to mourning? The young she-dragon hatched moons before Prince Viserys was born, but it seemed a natural pick to make them grow together. Alicent had thought she understood what Rubeus Hagrid meant about the dangerous overcrowding of dragons before, but the sight above her painted the picture far cleaner. Somehow it boosted her confidence in their plans, since securing Rubeus on their side had been a contested issue for a while, but this strengthened her resolve. Their solution seemed the most reasonable for everyone. In this procession alone there were twice as many dragons able to carry riders as their children had combined. At least for now. Lady Bela would soon be Aegon's wife, and then Harrel would bring in Norbert and Vhagar once she married Aemond. But Helena... Since the betrothal, Alicent had found herself praying for Helena's soul every night and morning, and what made it worse was her father Otto. He had always been a proud grandsire, involved and pleased with all 4 of Alicent's children, but ever since Helena's betrothal to Rhaenyra's bastards, he'd begun coaching her, preparing her, as he'd done for Alicent once upon a time. She wasn't sure why it upset her, because she knew her father was only trying to protect their family, and if Helena was met with such a damning fate, then it was for the better. She knew what to expect. And yet... it felt like one of Helena's insects was slithering underneath her dress. Her stomach was in knots and her skin crawled. Imagining her pure innocent princess, born in the image of the maid herself, be defiled by a spawn of how strong tormented Alicent's every waking moment. A sting in her finger made Alicent glance down. Distracted by her troubled mind, she'd been poking her nails until they bled, not noticing before she'd made a proper wound of it. She forced her hands into fists and wondered why she kept marring her appearance so. Bloodied fingers were unseemly, like a servant's stained hands. She needed to stop. Things needed to proceed perfectly, and Alicent refused to let anything more go wrong. She wasn't a princess, but Lady Bela was a true-born daughter of House Targaryen, with cleaner Valyrian blood than even her own children boasted. And this was what a legitimate royal wedding was supposed to look like. That even in winter, people came outside with applause and fanfare, with ceremonies blessed in the light of the 7. In the meanwhile, Rhaenyra and Daemon had married without the king's knowledge or approval, skirting duty for lust and honor for greed. Their union was between 2 thieves sneaking off in the night, whilst their son Aegon's marriage would be under the bright sun with the crowd's approval. and now everyone would be made to see and compare which was a wedding fit of a king and his queen. Hariel. Hariel watched the dragon keepers fasten a long heavy chain to the collar around Vermifor's neck, securing the dragon to his cave within the cliffs along the coastline. He stood docile while the humans chained him like a slave, because that's how he was raised. Had he tried that with Norbert, she'd have flipped out, tried to kill them all and would have likely succeeded. She might have allowed it if Hariel or Hagrid tried, but she'd start struggling once she realized she was stuck, and chains could only hold out so long against the dragon's strength and fire. But instead of minding his bondage, Vermifor was far more irate about the weather.
Why did I take on another pet? I didn't have to fly in the cold when I didn't have a pet.
Vermifor grumbled to himself, reminding her of the way Hagrid became exasperated with Fang when he did something particularly annoying, like steal a bee from the kitchen counter.
I like taking him flying. I sense he enjoys it very much. But my wings get cold, and everywhere else is cold of late too.
The heavy chains were long enough to give Vermifor freedom of movement on the ground, but left him incapable of flying off. It was winter though, and all Vermifor wanted was to huddle into his cave, going as deep as possible and start breathing fire to heat up the rocks. In the meanwhile, Norbert was becoming a small dot in the sky, flying back to Dragonstone. Since it had been in poor taste to take attention away from the wedding, Hariel had opted not to fly directly to the Red Keep, even if it would have saved her some time. Instead, Norbert led her off on the beach, and she wasn't alone. There were too many dragons pouring into King's Landing for Aegon and Bela's wedding to fit in the dragon pit, so Caraxes and Melis were being chained up in alternative caves for the stay too.
He is mine though, and I do not wish him to die like my last.
You mean your last pet? Hariel asked, curious he'd mentioned King Jaehaerys.
He became weak and could not fly. Then he died. For many years it was so quiet. My new pet is more willful, but young, wingless and fireless. Without me he will freeze or may try to fly without me and die. It would be nice to be in Silverwing's nest. Her nest is warm in winter, but she does not like I have my pet whilst she does not. I told her to find another one, and she got mad.
Hariel covered her grin behind a hand, stifling a giggle as Vermifor turned to retreat into his cave.
You will see him out of the cold before he freezes?
He asked. I will, she said, biting down her bottom lip. Vermifor often spoke as if Aemond might stroll off a cliff and die if no one watched him closely. She suspected this was mostly the fault of King Jaehaerys though. Vermifor had watched his first rider be trailed by humans, the Kingsguard, constantly, jumping at attention to carry his cups and guard his back alike, and now the dragon couldn't fathom why his new pet didn't receive the same level of supervision. What did he say to you? Aemond asked suspiciously. Oh, only that it's cold outside. Are you ready to head up to the castle? Hariel peered through the gaps of the carriage panels to the people outside, glimpsing moments as they went about their day. Unlike a car, there was no glass, and cold air wafted against her cheek through the openings. The trip by horse, a drawn carriage from Vermifor's cave to the Red Keep, took about half an hour. They travelled along the coast to get to the Rosby Road, and followed that until they passed through the Iron Gate into the city. They had just turned the corner from the Rose Road to the streets of Looms, with the Red Keep up ahead. Do you not think Vermifor would be warmer and more comfortable in the cave with Silverwing? Hariel mused, and through the slim gap her gaze accidentally locked with a gaunt man seated on the ground with feet drawn up under him. It stood out because the cold winds made people prefer the indoors, and among all those who still ventured outside, few chose to sit on the chilly ground. He was huddled in stained rags, skin dirty, one eye as smaller than the other, and a wound on his white nose. Probably, but even when roaming free he always returns for me, Eamon said, and then cleared his voice. Rubius arrived yesterday with a ship from Dragonstone loaded with Bela's belongings. He became ill from the motion of the ship, but he's been made comfortable up at the castle. His tone caught her attention and Hariel glanced back. He always gets ill. The stark contrast between the prince and the man sitting outside made her judge Aemond, even though for once he wasn't perfectly polished. His hair was tangled, clothes disheveled and his face flushed from the exertion of flying and the cold. It suited him, because Hariel could easily picture Aemond walking off the Quidditch pitch this way. But you couldn't help note how neat his clothes were, thick and tailored with warm wool blankets and a fur over his lap to keep him warm. Then she glanced down at herself, seated in fine clothes and huddled under layers too, and had to acknowledge she had little room to judge him. She was just as pampered, while the man outside... Aye, he said so. Aemond straightened. I hope you're not worn out from the flight though. Rubius accepted an invitation for the both of you to dine with us today, he said. Supper? There would be a feast during the wedding the following day, so she never expected anything grand for that afternoon. However, something in Aemond's voice made her think it was more than a meal. Thank you, I'll be there, she said, then changed the topic completely before it was too late and gestured to the fur draped over her lap. Could I have this for my own? Aemond blinked but took the abrupt change of topic in stride. If it pleases you, it's yours. I'm grateful, Aemond. Hariel knocked on the panel between them and the rider. Stop the carriage, she commanded, stood up and opened the door. With the fur in hand, she jumped onto the street before the carriage had a chance to stop. An exasperated Aemond cursed under his breath as he rushed to follow. They were back inside the carriage within 2 minutes. Do you feel better now? Aemond griped, taking the seat closest to the door this time. A little, Hariel admitted. He had greater need of it. Millions do, Aemond said as the carriage lurched when it started moving again. You could have been hurt, Hariel. The carriage hadn't even stopped. I'm ordering a lock for that door. He used to lock me up too, Hariel muttered under her breath, but Aemond heard it. Of course he did. The carriage wasn't spacious, their seats about the same size as the back of Uncle Vernon's car. Pardon? Hariel gestured towards the door and pretended the verbal blunder never happened. Well, as many locks as you can fit, my prince, but none of them could hold me. A part of me dearly misses the days such remarks still surprised me, Aemond complained, picking up his abandoned fur and draping it over Hariel's lap, while contenting himself with a wool blanket instead. But did you consider the consequences of your actions? What about his many cold-fingered acquaintances down the street praying for a short winter? He wondered, reaching out to take her hand. His fingers were cold, so she wrapped her other one over his to warm it. Aemond's lips twitched up in thanks before he continued his pessimistic little lecture. What about the woman struggling to feed her cold children? The little boy down in Flea Bottom without footwear? The half-undressed whore at the corner risking illness luring patrons for her madam's brothel? They all need it too, and a quality fur such as you gifted the beggar has great value. How long will it take before someone colder and more desperate than him steals it? Will he give it up willingly or fight back? Which of them will come out of it alive, I wonder? And all of it would have been prevented if you did not give him that fur. Hariel stared mutely at their hands, the scenarios he painted spinning around in her head. It'd be easier to dismiss if Aemond just didn't understand, and she suspected he didn't. Not truly. He'd been taught off desperation, how it came about and how to avoid it, but never felt it himself. He understood it in theory, but not in practice. However, the strange side effect of helping one person was the guilt over not aiding the rest. The injustice of picking one to help, and whether he deserved it more or less than all those she'd overlooked, and how Hariel became the bad one when she picked wrong. At least I did something to aid him when no one else did. Even you and Hagrid combined to not possess magic enough to satisfy everyone, Hariel, Aemond said quietly, softening his statement with a gentle squeeze of her hand. If If you give unconditionally, people will take advantage and it'll turn into an open invitation to abuse you. The demands after your generosity will never cease, and if you still keep giving, soon they'll assume it an expected commodity and not a gift. They will pick you apart like crows to a carcass until you're nothing but bare bones, and still they'll feel entitled for more. How will you aid anyone then? It's not about giving everything, it's about acknowledging the issue and trying a little better than doing nothing. If more people did a little, the total sum would be equivalent to a lot. And because the worst isn't always guaranteed to happen, ain't it? Ariel argued. Perchance the man will share his new fur with his acquaintances willingly instead of hoarding it to himself, because he doesn't want them to suffer the cold the way he did. Maybe he can huddle several of his young children under it. Maybe he can turn it into several hats so they can stay warmer. Maybe he'll use it as padding to his clothes, and when an attack you assume comes for him, the fur layer is enough to turn a jab by a blunted blade from a deep stab into a shallow cut. The carriage shook while rolling over uneven cobblestones, but Eamon held eye contact, a wry grin softening the sharp lines of his face. Fine. Ariel wasn't sure what he meant. Eamon was inclined to view a situation as if the cup was half empty instead of half full, and it usually took more to convince him of the opposite. The capitulation left her a little unbalanced. Fine? Fine, he repeated, the smile on his lips fond. The Red Keep was bustling with pre-wedding preparations, so Ariel spent the day inside Hagrid's expandable trunk. Though he was given rooms at the Red Keep, there were no beds big enough for him to use, nor were the rooms comfortable for his height. It was simply more convenient for him to bring the trunk and live out of that. She passed the hours playing cards with Hagrid while Fang tottered restlessly around her feet till it was time for supper, and they made their way together.
I told him that if the kitchens are so busy with the wedding, then I don't mind making a meal for us down in me trunk. I've got a stove and oven, and it's no trouble making food down there. If they think it's cramped, we could just bring the food up, but he insists to do it their way.
Hagrid told Ariel in English while they walked down the corridor to the Queen's apartments. Have you showed your stove and oven to the hand? Ariel wondered.
I did. Last time we were here, he came by for tea and I showed it to him. He was as fascinated with the knobs on the stove as Prince Damon was with the shower. So weird what the muggles find entertaining, ain't it?
Uh-huh, Ariel said distractedly, brushing down her gown. Hagrid sensed her nervousness.
I'm telling you, I'm confident it's just dinner.
It's not just dinner, Ariel rebuffed, unable to shake the feeling there was a lot more behind this. With all the weddings and betrothals of the last few months, her mind was leaning in certain directions here.
We've eaten with them before, and I had tea with Otto a few times during our last stay in the castle. He's a pretty dry bloke who enjoys his books more than pets. He told me all about Oldtown and his high tower back in the Reach.
Exactly, and that was just the two of you. Why am I suddenly invited?
Why wouldn't you be invited?
He asked as he reached the guarded door to the Queen's apartments. Ariel looked at him pointedly, because sure, Hagrid could be oblivious, but after years in Westeros he wasn't that blind. They were led inside, Hagrid having to bend to get through the opening, and found they were the last to arrive to a table set for 7 people. Aemond, Queen Alicent, Otto Hightower, the Master of Coin Lord Beesbury, and the Master of Laws Jasper Wilde were already occupying 5 of the 7 seats. While Wilde was scowling, Aemond sat rigid and tight-lipped in contrast to the Queen, who was positively radiating grace and composure. Bloody hell. Hagrid scratched his chin thoughtfully.
Alright, you might have been right. My bad.
Seated between Hagrid and Aemond, Ariel ate her meal and made polite small talk, but found it harder than it should have been. She was too preoccupied puzzling out what the hell would come at the end of a meal, as the people seated around the table didn't add up. Why was Beesbury and Wilde there? Where was Helena, Aegon, Daeron? Why was the Queen here and not the King? Though he had health issues, so that made some sense. But hell, Ariel would have expected Otto's nephew Ormond to dine with them before the Master of Laws and Coin. Because frankly, if they were about to smack her in the face with a betrothal proposal, this was going way overboard. As long as Aemond had the King's approval, he could renegotiate these things himself, and she'd actually assumed he would. When she was 17, not 16 and a month. But maybe their abrupt betrothals and unexpected marriages had made them jumpy.
Have you ever been there, Rubius?
Otto asked, drawing Hariel out of her train of thoughts.
Nah, I think the closest I've been was when I went to Claw Isle for a wedding a few years ago, but we kept to the island during the visit and never headed onto the mainland.
It's east past Maidenpool, and the area has a long history and deep folklore. It's part of the Crownlands with rich pine barrens and cavernous hills, the Queen said, eyes twinkling.
I remember many years ago, during a trip to House Brune, I passed by one of the ruined strongholds throughout the region. Their occupants are animals and insects these days, since the ruins have been covered under moss, dirt and growth since their destructions, Otto said, taking a sip of his wine. I only saw the one along the road, but I've been told there's more, such as the Whispers, an ancient castle long fallen into ruin that's still viewable if you think to visit House Crab. Sounds like an interesting place, then,
Hagrid said politely, trying not to be rude by asking why on earth he'd visit House Crab. If Hariel remembered correctly, their seat was somewhere along the Cracklaw Point. It was a very short boat trip from Dragonstone, but not a place Hagrid was likely to visit out of the blue.
It's promising you think so, Rubius.
Otto gestured for the servant to take away their plates.
Because we have a proposition for you on behalf of the Crown.
At once, Hariel turned to Aemond, and there was something almost apologetic in his expression. She'd been right. They were reopening the betrothal negotiations, weren't they? A servant who'd helped clean the table handed Otto a scroll, which he unfolded on the table. This is the offer I'm honored to present to you on behalf of His Grace, King Viserys of House Targaryen. Otto pushed it towards Hagrid.
I'm not as good as reading common tongue as Hariel is,
Hagrid said, and pushed the paper towards her. Hariel started reading, her suspicion falling away to bewilderment. It wasn't a betrothal contract. It was about Hagrid and his years of petitioning for changes to the dragon-rearing methods on Dragonstone. Specifically the overcrowding problem they'd been struggling with. It seemed they'd come to their senses at last, though she doubted the timing of her revelation was accidental. After Stormcloud and Morgul's death by the cannibal, Hagrid had refused to hatch any more eggs to replace them. He still cared for the young dragons left, but had ignored the orders from Rhaenyra and Daemon to try to hatch one of the eggs in the Dragon Mount, and wouldn't unless they found more space where the youngest dragons could safely roam without risk of being consumed by their own. He'd been saying so for years, but it seemed he'd finally been heard. This is in regards to the dragon-rearing alterations you've suggested, Hagrid. King Viserys has agreed to expand the dragon settlements to a third location. It'll be a dragon settlement for the purpose of hatching eggs and supervising young dragons under the control of House Targaryen. And they want you to run it, Hariel explained in English, ignoring the confused expression of Lord Beesbury and Lord Wilde, who'd probably never heard English before. In exchange for this service, as well as to reward you for your previous service to the realm, they're giving you lands, Hagrid. Hariel pointed to the section she knew he wouldn't have been able to read. It's at the northeastern coast of Cracklaw Point. No castle, but 2 ruins are located on the lands and there's a small fishing village there. Stunned, Hagrid leaned forward, struggling to read the parts Hariel clarified for him.
Why is your name here? Does it say you're my heir?
It does. Hariel pursed her lips. They're giving you lands, but the contract specified that I will remain your heir even if you marry someone and or have children. Hagrid's brows climbed.
I'm not marrying. They know that.
They do, but it's still in the contract. And the inclusion made Hariel think she knew what their angle was.
A bit unnecessary, but very thoughtful of them to make sure you're officially named as my heir. With the laws they have here, I can see why it'd be needed, you being a girl and not related to me and all that nonsense.
Hagrid hummed agreeable, and Hariel barely refrained from smacking her forehead. No, Hagrid, it's not out of kindness. It's a reassurance and a safety measure to keep you in line through me, Hariel said quietly. What are the stipulations? Hariel asked Otto, gesturing towards the end of the written agreement. It says here this agreement will only be valid as long as these stipulations are upheld. Is this in regards to Hagrid? Will he only be allowed these lands if he swears an oath to never take a wife or sire children, like the Kingsguard does?
He will not need to have to go so far, no, Otto said. He has long deserved recognition for his unparalleled services to the crown, yet his actions with Vhagar made such difficult. Many would argue he's already been repaid more than he deserves by bonding Vhagar without leave, and to reward him further would be wrong.
What do you think? Harrel challenged.
It's an argument I've made myself, but I can also acknowledge that after his oath not to fly Vhagar, in practice all Rubius was awarded from bonding with Vhagar was one trip to and from the north on Dragonback, and that isn't of the same value.
Harrel was relieved to hear him acknowledge the reality of it out loud. Alison took over, talking briskly. We expect you're aware that after Rubius Hagrid bonded to Vhagar, the Crown requires solid assurances of his continued loyalty to our Targaryen before we can reward him from our coffers. The safety of the kingdoms goes before any sole person, and there is only one way to create assured alliances. A marriage pact, Harrel surmised. Yes. The Queen leaned forwards, hands folded on the table. Between yourself and my son, Prince Aemond. It took several seconds, where Harrel was certain neither she or Aemond were actually breathing. The tension broke when Hagrid grabbed the end of the table so hard he heard the thick wooden board groan.
I've told you this 1,000 times! Harrel will not marry until she's of age! You don't see me poking my nose into how you marry your children off, but will not have your child bride practices forced on her. You might be alright gambling little girls' health and lives that way, but we're not, he said, his voice dead serious and his expression hard in a way Harrel had rarely seen. If she was to compare it to anything, it had been the time Uncle Vernon called Dumbledore some crackpot old fool in front of Hagrid. It was extremely intimidating, and no one spoke against Hagrid on this. Even Jasper Wilde kept his mouth shut, though only barely. Probably because all 4 of his wives to date had been mothers before reaching their 16th birthday. Though she's my responsibility and we're from the same country, I'm not her parent or relative, and I've got no right to decide whom she marries. Only she does. But her safety is my responsibility, so you better all have an opinion about people trying to force her into something.
Which is why we invited Lady Harriel, Otto said, and nodded to Aemond. My grandson insisted, and if you only allow me to inform you of the offer, you'll find it's most generous, and should please all parties involved. Otto proved a braver man than Uncle Vernon, and kept perfectly collected despite Hagrid's looming shadow, before settling his hard gaze on her instead. Lady Harriel, you and Prince Aemond have courted for moons. Our proposal is that the 2 of you will continue as is, but as a betrothed couple, and your marriage will wait until you're 7 and 10. Rubius will become Lord Rubius Hagrid, and Lady Harriel Potter his sole heir. Harriel inhaled deeply, her elbow accidentally brushing against Aemond's as she did so. And since all this only happens as long as Aemond and I marry, you intend for the lands to return under the control of House Targaryen. Harriel spelled it out, because there was no reason to pretend here.
In time, yes, but it'd be many years away, Otto said softly. Any lands awarded to Rubius will be made to accommodate a dragon regardless, either for Norbert's sake or even Vhagar, as we can't prevent her from following after her bonded. The king has agreed to raise the new dragon sanctuary at Cracklaw in order for Rubius to continue his duties to the realm. The crown will finance the new facilities for newly hatched and young dragons there, as well as a keep for Lord Rubius near the enclosure, which will eventually be under the rule of your son, a future Targaryen of Cracklaw.
What if I have no son? Harriel folded her arms. There was an awkward silence where several were glancing between herself and Aemond, as she hurried to clarify before someone thought to give her the birds and the beanstalk. What if I birth daughters, or what if I die in childbed? Hagrid glanced to her alarmed, and Otto answered while doing his best to sound calmly reasonable. I pray that will not befall you, but in that case the lands will pass to your husband Aemond, he said. And if you were so unfortunate to both pass with no heir, then the inheritance would go to the closest Targaryen relative. It has to, because of the Dragon Sanctuary. Harriel assumed that meant any daughter would be overlooked and everything would pass to Aegon? Probably. For firstly, Rubius Hagrid will be lord of these lands for the remains of his life, and upon your passing, Lady Harriel will be your heir. Is that not something you wish for, Rubius? You will continue working with hatchlings and rearing dragons. Lady Harriel will be the lady of the keep. Her children will be safe and have a place to grow up, and Norbert will have lands to roam. Is that not what you've been working to achieve? To give Lady Harriel back the life she was torn away from, the life she deserves. Otto spoke directly to Hagrid, hinting at something they'd likely talked of during one of their tea meetings. And he was hitting some nerves too, since Hagrid was becoming conflicted. It sounded, well, as far as marriage pacts went, Harriel could see this was a pretty beneficial one. Traditionally, it was the bride's family who were made to pay the grooms, because that's what dowries were. Harriel's dowry was Norbert and any eggs she may hatch in the future, which would be exceptional to any house except House Targaryen. This marriage pact was quite unorthodox, because it was so much more than just the marriage. It was lands and future constructions and successions all wrapped into one. Or maybe this was precisely how all marriage pacts were. Not truly about the people at the center, but the pieces moving around them. The one thing was clear enough. As long as Harriel married into House Targaryen, they were willing to be generous. And though Hagrid was clearly thinking of Harriel's future, she was thinking of his. Lord Rubius Hagrid. How would that work? Hagrid had no experience with governing. He barely knew enough not to break laws, too much. Yet, as Lord he'd have to run the lands, which meant looking after the small folk, both to collect taxes as well as policing, which could be unpleasant and time-consuming, especially when someone broke the law and Hagrid would be the one to decide what to do with them, when all he wanted was to care for dragons. Not to mention what sort of responsibilities he'd be faced with if war broke out. As a lord in the Crown Lands, he'd answer directly to Viserys, who'd be both his liege lord and king. He'd need a freaking coat of arms. I won't agree to anything before I know more. Hagrid broke the silence. I don't just mean Harriel's say on this, and we'll need to have a long talk too. But I mean how it's supposed to work. Where this land is, what's on it, if it's sustainable to live off after putting dragons into the environment. Predators like that impact the hunting grounds quite a bit, and I also need to know knowledge of what this dragon enclosure includes. I'd love to hatch dragons somewhere safer for them than Dragonstone. It's about time you did so. But it's not something I can run on my own, not unless you expect me to never sleep again. I'll need other dragon keepers there too. Understood precaution, my lord, Beesbury said. That's why I'm here. I've drafted an estimation on the gold requirements for the enclosure which I need your expertise on. Look over what I've included and potentially inform me if there's something required to dragon rearing I'm unaware of that's not listed here. Lord Wilde has the details concerning the lands King Viserys is gifting you, Lord Rubius. If we can go over them together now. As the Master of Coin brought forth a parchment covered in neatly scripted numbers and plans, Harriel turned to Aemond. How come you failed to inform me of this? She muttered under her breath. He leaned towards her, reaching for the jug of cider on her other side simultaneously. When I made an attempt to, you ran out while the carriage was still in motion. Harriel rolled her eyes, certain he had found a way to tell her if he'd made a priority of it. What do you think, though? Aemond asked, and though he was already leaned close, she barely heard it. It may not be Driftmark or Winterfell, or anything much of yet, but with time we'll make it something great. There was a defensiveness in the way he said it. At first she couldn't understand why it'd be there, before it clicked. Harriel's throat closed up. Had he pushed for this arrangement? For Hagrid? To find a solution because of her concerns over Norbert, flying in the restrictions of the Red Keep? Harriel wasn't sure what she'd expected from him, but she was surprised regardless. Until now, a part of her assumed he'd ignore it? Aemond made no secret of how much he'd hated living with his nephews on Dragonstone, and Harriel had worried that despite her reasons, she'd still end up in the capital, bound to attend courts, limited to only fly Norbert on rare occasions, and only do magic behind closed doors so as not to upset others. Even if her rooms were nicer and the bed softer, it was nearly as restrictive as the Dursleys there. Though why she kept expecting that from Eamon didn't make sense either. Eamon disagreed with her a lot, but he didn't dismiss her. Perhaps she had it wrong. Maybe she was the pessimistic one between them, the one assuming the glass was half empty, unable to expect something could work out for the better, that someone cared enough to try and make it better. It hit her all at once, so overwhelming it left Ariel struggling for words while Eamon nervously waited for her reply. Since none came, she reached for his hand under the table, intertwining their fingers tightly. They parted ways after the meal, promising to have an answer from him early next morning. Bringing along a jug of ale taken from the dinner table, Hagrid led Ariel straight to his rooms and the expendable trunk to talk it over.
It doesn't seem right. I'll be given all this stuff, but you're the one who's bound in the contract, the one who's paying for it,
Hagrid said, as since it was only the two of them, his English flowed easier but frustrated. It's not just me. I couldn't do what you do with the dragons. I could do the spells and such, but I'd still fall flat compared to you.
But you're not a benefactor, are you? In return for my work, I get to do my dream job and now be a lord of my own bloody castle. But what of you? You're just a kid. You and Eamon are both kids. I know he's very smitten with you, how can he not be? But it's not right the two of you are being pushed into this because the adults got trust issues.
Ariel shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She found it difficult to talk about this with him. Hagrid tried so hard, but there wasn't much he could do. Ariel feared if he tried, he'd actually make things worse. So she didn't want him to be concerned over things he was powerless to stop. What was the point? He had enough on his plate as is.
I know you've been dating Eamon, but how do you feel?
Hagrid asked, leaning forwards.
You're very young to be making these decisions, and at the same time we both know Westeros ain't exactly Hogwarts either.
Ariel smiled wryly. That was the understatement of the decade. No, it's not. What did she feel about this? Could something feel forced and freeing at the same time? On one side, she felt pressured to exchange her future for lands and a building. On the other side, the situation meant she gained security, stability, and the potential for so much more freedom on a daily basis. Not only with the gain a home that couldn't so easily be ripped away, but instead of answering to Daemon, Rhaenyra or the King, she and Aemond would be under Hagrid's roof, and they might not realize how long their kind lived. The Westerosi probably assumed as a man nearing 70 that Hagrid was at the end of his life, with perhaps a decade left, too if he was exceptionally fortunate. Of course it was impossible to know how long someone would live. People with magic could get sick and have their lives cut short just as Muggles could have a sudden heart attack and die at 40, despite most being expected to reach 80. But statistically, wizards and witches lived longer than Muggles. Norbert would have better hunting grounds, lands and sea to roam, as she'd be less at risk of being eaten by the cannibal. Ariel combed her fingers through her hair while watching Fang roll around. He'd been sleeping in Hagrid's armchair, but when Ariel looked at him his tail started wagging, happy to have attention.
Norbert's grown too large for him, Hagrid said. He likes to eat him young and tender.
Ariel shook away the unnerving description. Right, but he's still pretty dangerous.
Aye, he is. It all comes down to Aemond, doesn't it? Hagrid asked. Is he who you want to marry?
Ariel swallowed. Such a big decision. She was but 16 years old and somehow she was supposed to know what was best for the rest of her life. Decades ahead when she couldn't know what would happen. Her first 16 years were spent jumping between extremes, and how could she trust life wouldn't throw her another curveball? Maybe several. Look at Sir Laenor. One moment the family is whole, and within 2 weeks Emma and Laenor were dead, while the rest of the kids got a new stepfather and step-siblings. In her frustration, Ariel couldn't help but wonder what Ron was doing. Living happily with his parents and siblings. Going to magic school and thinking Malfoy was the worst that could happen to someone. He'd never gone hungry, thirsty, cold, or without a roof over his head. His main concern was probably some Quidditch match, and the only choice he was forced to make was whether to study that afternoon or play chess. How trivial it was. And had Ariel never gone down to Hagrid's, that life would have been hers too. Carefree and perfect with her friends at Hogwarts. The instant the thought entered her mind, Ariel pushed it away, a wave of guilt washing through her. She'd never want Hagrid to be left stranded and alone. You seem reluctant to me, not very enthused. The situation makes it impossible to be enthused, Ariel argued as Fang jumped down from the chair and came over for petting, attention, and to sniff after any leftover food falling to the floor. It's about being forced to be put in a situation where her only two options were to either reject their offer and likely make outlaws of herself and Hagrid, or to sell herself like a whore for a chance of a stable future. Why could there never be a middle ground? Why was everything always absolutes with these people? Why haven't you married anyone, Hagrid? Ariel asked instead.
When would I have time for such, Ariel? I'm always with the dragons.
He tried to wave it off with jokes, but Ariel needed some outside perspective. And before, she pressed. Back at Hogwarts, were you busy back then too? He reached over for the jug and poured himself more ale.
I've always kept myself busy, both here and at Hogwarts.
He struggled for words, but eventually relented.
It was never in the cards for me, Ariel. There weren't anyone like me around to make such work, and I liked the outdoors and the creatures. I lived at the school and never got lonely.
She could sense they'd entered a sensitive subject for him, and there was something warning her to tread carefully, that Hagrid might not appreciate it if she pried into this. Do you ever regret it, not doing the wife and kids thing? Hagrid drank a mouthful of ale, allowing Fang's intensive sniffing to be the only sound for several seconds.
I used to be afraid of dying alone, but I don't think that way anymore, not for myself at least.
Ariel frowned.
I mean, yeah, Ariel.
Hagrid smiled, a faint glint in his black eyes.
I'm not planning to go anytime soon, but I do worry about the day I do. It won't be now, but it will be before you, and I don't want you to end up alone in this strange world, stuck on a hut at the edge of Dragonstone. I want better for you, but it's hard to give you in this world. Really bloody hard. But there's an opportunity here, isn't there? But it's up to you, Ariel.
Ariel smiled weakly. Even if things weren't perfect, she owed it to herself and Hagrid to try be happy. When had life ever been perfect? The months she'd been at Hogwarts came close, but there was no way for them to get them back, was there? And she learned years ago wallowing did little but make herself miserable. Instead, she tried to picture this future, living in some vague forested area of the Crownlands by the coast in an indistinct castle-like structure. There they would be free to use magic as they pleased, because Hagrid would be the lord and set the rules of the household. She'd be married to Aemond, who would definitely enjoy living in a magical place, and they'd have kids. Ariel wanted a family, and she believed Aemond would make a dedicated husband and father. But she still struggled with the incest practices of House Targaryen. It had looked like they were improving for a while, but Daemon and Rhaenyra's marriage scared her. From tomorrow onwards, after Aegon and Bela were married, Daemon would not only be the father of the bride, but simultaneously be the groom's uncle, his brother-in-law and father-in-law at the same time, while Rhaenyra would both be Aegon's sister and mother-in-law, and also be Bela's stepmother, her aunt, her sister-in-law, and her second cousin once removed. That should be illegal! In fact, it was illegal, for everyone except them. And through a marriage to Aemond, Ariel's kids would also be one of them. So the question became, could she make Aemond promise none of their kids would marry each other? make him agree to follow the marriage laws of the faith, which excluded a person from marrying their siblings, parents, aunts, uncles, nephews or nieces. Ariel didn't follow the religion, but he did, so there was a chance, wasn't there? Maybe it'd be easier to convince him away from the politics of the capital too, which excited Ariel, though it would probably make Eamon frustrated in the long run. Being out of the loop would make him antsy, but he could always fly there whenever the absence grew too bad. But even when he was with her, she could think of several ways to keep someone as ambitious as him productive. Because Hagrid had zero knowledge of how to be a lord. Ariel knew a little more after years of learning how to be married to a lord. But it likely wasn't enough, and Eamon could be very useful there. It could be great actually. Ariel took a big gulp of her ale and placed it on the table with a sharp clatter. Let's stop pretending, Hagrid. This is too good an opportunity to pass up. I like Eamon, and I believe he'll treat me well. It's not some ridiculous offer. They could have suggested I marry Prince Joffrey. Hagrid grimaced. Joffrey? He just turned 4! I'm very aware, thanks. But that hasn't stopped it from being discussed. Ariel grumbled, satisfied when Hagrid's expression showed the appropriate amount of disgust. So few did. A lot of my worries about Eamon was his home address, but if he can be at Cracklaw, it's different. Hagrid eyed her concerned. Are you sure? I won't mind either way, you know. I'm behind whatever you decide here, Ariel. I know, Ariel said quietly. And I'm behind you. You, me, Fang, Norbert, and anyone else who's crazy enough to willingly come live under our roof. We can make it whatever we want. A true home. That does sound nice, Hagrid mused. Ugh, I have to come up with a coat of arms now. Is it cheating to just use the Hogwarts sigil? Any further talk of sigils was interrupted when Fang suddenly burst into action, throwing himself under Hagrid's bed with a snarl. What the? They hurried to investigate while Fang came crawling back out from underneath the massive bed, looking very pleased with the dead mouse trapped in his jaw. Hagrid grabbed hold of his dog at once, and their conversation had to take a break while he wrestled the mouse out of Fang's mouth. I had to get it before he swallowed it, Hagrid said after successfully getting the dead animal from Fang. He'd have eaten it and then end up throwing it up in a few hours. Chuckling, Ariel reached out to scratch Fang behind the ear. Good boy. There were too many bloody rodents in this castle. Fang might not be brave against dragons, but at least he made a pretty decent substitute for a cat.